So in case you missed the news, Scarlet Nexus finally hit 2 million players. The game has made it kind of big. So today I wanted to take some time and talk about where I think the game might be headed, if there is even a future for it at all. As a note, yes, there will be spoilers in this. This is a talk about the future of Scarlet Nexus, which will involve showing and talking about some of the endgame content in the game. So please keep that in mind. Anyways, this includes DLC, so yeah, keep that in mind. Moving on. So the first game ends with a few things to note. For one, Yuito is losing his powers, or he might. This leads him to want to become a politician, where Kasane is not in danger of this, and she wants to go to the moon. You can pretty clearly divide where everyone's going to be. They're the people who are going to go to the moon and help Kasane, and they're the people who are going to stay on Earth, and then there's Arashi.
So you're going to pretend you didn't hear me?
If you look at the anime, on the other hand, Yuito has already lost his powers, and the OSF is still going, while everyone is also forgetting who Karin is. However, I wouldn't take the anime as canon, as it is referenced in the game as kind of a way to showcase their events. It's not really a total canon retelling, and there are some changes in the anime that really just make the story worse. We also know for sure, after episode Karin and all of that, that there's really nothing left to do for Karin. We've kind of covered that whole story arc, and there's no real need to bring him up. I think it's also important to discuss why there might be a sequel, or why we're talking about a sequel in general. From what we know, Scarlet Nexus is really a passion project. It was in development for about 6 years at Bandai Namco, and the game's director, Kenji Anabuki, has discussed interest in making a sequel. Bandai also projected the game to reach 1 million units in sales by March of 2022. Of course, it did better than that in some ways. I'm sure Game Pass was a huge help to getting the player base to increase, but it might have missed that 1 million cutoff of March 2022 just for sales and total units, not counting the Game Pass users, subscribers. So I would say, putting that together, that a sequel is actually kind of likely. Bandai tends not to give up that much with their anime original IPs. I mean, Tales wouldn't have gotten 18 games and a few mobile games as well if Bandai was going to give up after just one try. What I'm trying to say here is that Bandai isn't afraid to dip their toes into new waters and experiment a little bit. They're also really not short for cash either. They're not just a gaming company. I mean, they own Gundam, I'm pretty sure, and they have a pretty large list of large anime franchises under their belt. They also do publish other games besides just these anime original IPs, so I'm sure they're not short for money in any way, shape, or form, and that means they're not afraid to experiment a little bit when they want to. Essentially what I'm saying is, don't underestimate the power of a few very large IPs. A few months back, there was an interview with the game's director, Kenji Anabuki, and the game's producer, Keita Iizuka. They mentioned a few things worth noting about the future of Scarlet Nexus. First and foremost, Anabuki notes that he wants to approach superpowers from a more mature perspective. Which, I mean, can't say the game wasn't already headed in that direction. Okay, I'll stop. He also noted that things like the dangers of having or using superpowers were on his mind. I think that could be a potentially interesting idea. There is a little bit of it with Gemma and Arashi, who both have had their superpowers kind of backfire on them, either purposefully or unpurposefully.
I used my hypervelocity and tore my limbs off when I hit a wall.
Anyways, point being that this idea is actually placed in the base game as well, but it's not fully fleshed out, which means there's a lot of places it can go. Anabuki also mentions that he's not sure whether he wants to just keep the same world or also keep the same characters. I think, depending on the setting for the story, a little bit of both is good. I mean, Yuito is going to lose his powers, so there's no reason to really keep him as a playable character. I think he would work as a background character or side character who has a somewhat pivotal role. Meanwhile, you can keep Kasane because she still has her powers, so it makes sense to keep her around. For the other side characters, I think it's good to keep them around. However, I don't think you need to keep all of them cohesively together. A lot of the characters note that they want to stay on Earth, and some note that they want to go to the moon, so you have to keep in mind that you can't really have SAS functioning at that distance. So I'm just saying, do what makes sense. There have also been a lot of post-launch updates for Scarlet Nexus. These include things like accessibility options and some minor new content outside of the DLC. For what it's worth, Anabuki has mentioned the worth of listening to your player base and listening to your consumer, and how important it is in this industry to do so. It's a very refreshing point of view, not one I think would have a lot to do with the sequel, but it could tie into features that we might see in the future. Another particular comment that caught my attention was Anabuki's talk about the use of superpowers outside of combat. In current Scarlet Nexus, you see a gate closing quick, use hypervelocity. You see a gate with electrical contraption next to it, use electrokinesis. It's not a very difficult puzzle-solving mechanic, however it's simple, and sometimes simple works best. At the same time, I think there's a lot of room to expand on this concept and expand on how powers are used outside of battle, maybe for things like making traversal faster. One of the big draws for Scarlet Nexus, for me at least, was that you could combine powers, and I want to see them do more with that in the future. As for the existing dual protagonist structure, I don't think it's something that has to stay in the game. While there are major differences between Yuito and Kasane's routes, I don't think you need to constantly keep it, as the endgame for this game really had not much variation between scenes. What I'm trying to say here is that I don't totally think it's necessary to keep this structure. You can either change it around and still have two protagonists, or you can keep it, or you could just not do it depending on what the story requires. What I'm trying to say here is not that I don't think we need it at all. It's more like, I want them to use it if it benefits the story. If there's no reason to use the dual protagonist structure, I don't think you need to insert it, at least this way again. Encouraging 2 playthroughs is nice and all, but it also would have been a little bit smoother if the game didn't have this exact structure. That portion of the game where both teams meet up really kind of just spoils stuff just in exposition, and it's kind of a shame that I didn't get to experience that same surprise when certain things happened with Kasane's team because I played Yuito's route first. What I essentially want to say is that this specific structure of dual protagonists, where you choose one and play through their whole story, is something that I think they should insert if it works for the new story that they create. It shouldn't be the main focus that they want to create a story with dual protagonists, unless that's what they want to do. I don't want the idea to be forced on them. I don't want them to force themselves into a hole where they feel like they have to use this concept. But if that's what they want to do, then it's cool. So in terms of my own thoughts of where to go, really getting into them, I think a sequel is really way off. Bandai games typically have a decent gap in between their most recent entry and the entry that comes after. If Bandai decides to give Anabuki and his team a chance to make a sequel, I want to see it fully cook. And honestly, I doubt we'd be seeing it for 2 to 4 years. Yeah, I could be proven wrong. I'm just saying that games aren't made very quickly now because the cost, the time, everything that goes into it, and we want the best game that could possibly be made, right? So I'm okay with that. I'm okay with waiting a few years to see when this game comes out, or if it comes out at all. I don't think we need to rush it, is what I'm saying. I think if you're approaching the game as a direct sequel, then speed up the timeline a little bit to already leaving for the moon. Maybe that's where the game starts. Maybe make note of some potential altered events. I know the base game talks about that a little bit and how history hasn't really changed all that much, but I still feel like filling in the gaps might be interesting. While I didn't mind the presentation of cutscenes in the base game, using stills for almost everything did sometimes feel like a budget issue or a time constraint. I would hope that a sequel would allow them to use more animated cutscenes. However, if this is the style they want to use and they want to stick to it, then I hope they hone it to perfection. I do also hope to see some extra complexity added to the combat. While Anabuki does talk about using superpowers outside of combat, I also hope the combat itself might get a little bit more complex. Maybe adding some more moves, or changing the power combinations to be more than just changing the property of what your attack button or what your dodge button does. For example, combining gravikinesis with pyrokinesis might lead to you being able to toss fireballs. Or combining teleportation and duplication might let you use an attack that is able to instantly hit a weak spot. Of course, I'm not really thinking about the balance of it all or anything like that yet. It's just food for the old brain eater. If it's done right, you could easily surpass the gameplay of the first game. With a whopping 2 million players in the last year, I think Scarlet Nexus really does have the chance to become a much larger franchise. And I really do hope to see another entry in this series sometime in the future. Thanks for watching. Please, if you have any thoughts about a sequel, Please leave your thoughts in the comments down below. I really love reading people's perspective and ideas on these things. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys next time.